And so Pete is going to demonstrate what gov.uk Verify actually is. And although, of course, you can go and try it for yourselves as it is now in beta. So you can try it online. We had a presentation recently and somebody pointed out that what we're doing here in terms of showing the UX research is actually worth millions of pounds to a private organisation. But what we are attempting to do here is to explain the logic behind this after the work that Pete has been leading. There's some valuable insights coming up here, so I'm sure you'll want to take note. So thank you very much, Pete. Gale.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is talk through what I'm showing you today is not the real live service. It's a prototype of the service. It's a prototype that we use in user research that we run every 2 weeks, I think. We run a single day of research every 2 weeks where we get 5 or 6 members of the public and get them to complete a task that includes a registration with Verify. And we use that as a continuous way of kind of identifying things that need to be refined in the service, trying out new ideas, and it gives us a place to experiment as well as a way of kind of refining what it is that we're doing. So in this context, someone has come to a page on gov.uk to renew their driving licence. They're presented with a very, very standard gov.uk transaction start page. At the moment, we don't say anything about the verification process that lays beyond. That's something we're actually looking at in our research and design cycles at the moment. We're kind of looking at the best ways of doing this, but currently we're not saying anything. We're letting that communication come a little bit later. And it's worth perhaps as well saying a little bit about the evolution of the user interface and some of the rationale behind that. The very, very earliest versions of Verify that we developed just took people to a page where they could pick a company to verify themselves. I think we called it the NASCAR page at the time. People had a really strong negative reaction to that it really, they didn't respond well to that in user research. There was a lot of rejection of that as a concept. There was a lack of understanding. The next thing we then tried to do, we evolved from there to a place where we put in some interstitial pages that really sought to explain the service to people and reassure them about using the service. So they had text explaining the service, they had video that really aimed to kind of reassure and explain the security and privacy principles behind the service, and then there was an interactive element that allowed people to choose an identity provider. We've evolved from that. We felt that version of the Verify was really trying to say everything to everyone, and that wasn't working. A lot of people just weren't engaging with the content at a level which would have been reassuring. The video that we knew was key to people getting kind of that positive message wasn't being played. So we evolved to this version, which is really trying to say the minimum possible to everyone, and then provide means of kind of exploring more for those people who need them. So the first thing we do is when they click through from a transaction, and we explain that before they, in this case, renew or update their driving license, they need to verify their identity. We don't talk about registration, we don't talk about signing in. We find that using those concepts brings problems. It introduces confusion about, well, am I registering with the government department? Am I registering with an identity provider? And it also sets expectations of a more conventional registration process that isn't what we're doing here. So we say, is this your first time verifying your identity? It's a simple question that people can answer, and we've got quite a strongly branded interface so people will recognize, hopefully will recognize this thing. So if I say yes, this is my first time, we then introduce some benefits. Again, the previous version tried to get people through by explaining how this thing works. And what we've realized is that just isn't relevant to a lot of people. People want to know why they should do it. Why is it good for them? So we say that very clearly here. It's fast. It takes about 10 minutes. Now, yep.
I've been using the government UK services for about 10 years now.
Yep.
When I come onto that service, my first question is, what's wrong with my existing credentials?
Now,
so yeah. Are you referring to the Government Gateway?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Government Gateway was introduced in 2001. It was an authentication solution. It wasn't an identity solution. So
that doesn't speak to me. So maybe you should need something there to explain to people who've been using government gateway services for 10 years that everything that's gone before is now null and void.
Yeah. And certainly we have done some research with government gateway users. I mean, your specific concerns are not ones that we've heard expressed. But yeah, you know, we are continuing to look at users, and I think that'll become...
Might have come up in your user modeling.
Well, in our user research that we've done, it hasn't come up. Okay. Shall I?
Yeah.
So the second page, like I said, the second page is really just about promoting some of the benefits for people of using this interface. And the next step, we introduce the certified companies that are going to identify them. Now, this is a prototype. These aren't the companies that are currently live, so this prototype is slightly out of sync with what's in production at the moment. But what we found is introducing these companies before people actually have to make a choice really helps people kind of manage that. It manages that transition into making that choice. And also we can, you know, we point out at this point that these companies have met standards set by government. We used to say that these companies can be trusted with your personal data. The response you get to that is, well, government trusts them, why should I trust them? So we just say that they've met standards. We find we get a much more positive response from that. And now we're into a part of the interaction where what we're trying to do is to make sure that people get to the best identity provider for their circumstances. Okay? And again, we're always seeking here to ask simple questions that everyone is going to be able to answer. Yeah?
I would have thought it would be advisable to tell people that, because my first reaction, are you 19 or over, what's that got to do with renewing my driving licence? There's some information already, I possess one.
Yeah.
Not just renewing it, but the sort of privacy issue is sort of, well, that's got nothing to do with it.
Yeah, I mean, so some of these issues we experience from time to time, and what we're trying to do is to find the simplest possible interface that meets the widest set of needs. And I think this is kind of, this approach it delivers better experiences across the board. But I mean, I take your point.
We're asking these questions to give you the best service.
Yes.
That's
yeah.
already okay. That's why you're asking
Yeah.
me strange questions.
Yeah.
We have got the recording isn't picking up the questions that are coming out there, so I'm going to have to repeat the questions that are being asked as we go through. So just to let everybody know, we're going to do that.
Yes.
Just one small point.
Yes.
On websites, you see a little question mark button that you can press Y.
Yes.
It just says Y. You can click it and it goes into detail. Most people won't use it.
Yep.
But you're offering it in a way that is edible.
Yes. So we're trying to keep within the gov.uk design patterns. Those elements that element itself is not within that pattern, but then we do have an equivalent. We do see in some places what we have is text that can be expanded, links that can be expanded within the page. And one of what we're trying to do is look at the points where the kind of information need builds up, and then provide links which are quite well aligned with those information needs at that point. So yeah, I mean, we are thinking about those sorts of approaches, but we're trying to do it. I think our whole principle here is to make this as simple as it possibly can be. And so we're trying to kind of condense where we're doing that. So, are we 90? Let's say I am 90, and this question is effectively a proxy for the question, do you have a credit history? The identity providers that we're using at the moment, some of them use credit footprints to generate questions that will determine whether or not it is genuinely the person who claims to be verified is the person sitting at the computer. So questions are generated that only that person can answer. To do that, they need a credit history. The question, do you have a credit history, is one that a very large percentage of people cannot answer. So we ask these instead. And it's not a perfect match for that, but it's close enough match, and it's simple enough that everyone can answer it. So if I say that I've moved to the UK in the last 12 months and I click next, we then take you to a page which explains why in more detail gov.uk verify might be a problem for you. So again, this messaging we're trying to put aside and keep it only for the people who absolutely need it and the people who ask for it. If we present this amount of information to everyone, what we find is they don't read it. They scan down the page looking for the next button or looking for the link, and it's not read. So we make sure that we're only giving the more detailed information to the people who genuinely need it. So in this case, we're providing the information, information that will allow people to determine whether or not they have sufficient credit footprint to get through, and we're showing them how else they can access this service if they don't think they'll be able to verify online. So let's go back, change this to say that I've lived in the UK for more than 12 months. I'm then asked what kind of identity documents I have and told that I'll need to refer to these the documents that I select. So in this case, I will say that I have a valid UK passport. And again, this is an example of where we're starting to provide, additional information for those people who need it only. I'm then asked what kind of telephone I have access to. Some of the identity providers use phones for two-factor authentication. So at the moment, and there's a couple of things we're doing here. We're preparing people to make sure that they've got the things together that they will need to go through the process. But we're also asking enough information to make sure that we're kind of effectively triaging them into the right channels, whether that's a specific identity provider or an offline channel if we don't think that they'd be able to be verified. So let's say I've just got a landline phone I've got access to, and we're now shown the identity companies that are available. There are two here. In this prototype, it's Verizon and Experian. Only Experian is currently live, and Verizon isn't currently live. But we're doing a couple of things. We're promoting the one which meets the criteria, the answers to the questions that we've already asked. So in this case, we believe that, in this hypothetical case, we believe that Verizon would be the best choice for this individual. We're providing them information about that company. So if not a company they're familiar with, they can learn a little bit more about that. But we're also making sure that we're making a recommendation. We're not preventing them from going to somewhere else. So if you'll see down here, you can also use Experian, but you're going to need a mobile phone. Now, one of the things that we see, because this is such a this interaction is so much about trust, brand is really important, and brand recognition and familiarity is really, really important to people. So we often see interactions where someone will come in and see something like this and say, perhaps I don't recognize, I don't know who Experian is. I'm not so comfortable. Who Verizon is. I'm not so comfortable using them. So I'll go for this one. I'll do it later. I'll do it when I'm at home, when I've got my passport or when I've got my phone. So we're supporting that use case here.
Do you publish the criteria for determining which is recommended? Think about Prop 2 procurement for IDPs. How do you make sure you're at the top of the list, if you like?
There's the random process in terms of putting them on the website. So there's no criteria that puts you top of the list. It's up to the individual to select.
But Verizon on top of the list there.
Well, that's randomly generated.
There's two things going on here. If there were, given the fact that this person has said they only have access to a landline for two-factor authentication, they've been recommended to use this one. If there are multiple identity providers who meet those criteria, it will be a random order across there. The other ones are provided below, also in random order, but the reasons are explained why they're not promoted higher. So all of this is based on the solutions developed by the identity provider, and our intention is to be as sure as possible that we get someone to a positive experience. We don't want someone going to an identity provider that requires mobile phone two-factor authentication when they're on a farm in a hill in Wales and they have no mobile coverage.
Okay, thank you.
Can I?
Can I make a quick suggestion?
Yep.
You just put a little note on there saying this hit against the Experian database will not show on your credit record searches.
We
it's a negative footprint, it's an invisible footprint.
Yes.
Experian has a number of different types of hits
Yes.
in their database, and some people recognise Experian and say, well, I don't want to be seen to be searching my credit record. So they need reassurance that it's not going to affect their credit history.
Yes. That messaging is at certain points in the interface. It's not on this page. It is at certain points in the interface. Yeah. Yeah.
Or they may need to know that.
Yep.
I know this is a mock-up, but I think Verizon, aren't they owned by the Americans, or they're British?
I believe they're Dutch, is it? Or?
They are.
Well, they're operating out of the Netherlands.
Yeah.
But they are owned by the Americans.
But they're an American
Scary
listed company.
stories I'm seeing about them demanding.
But
I personally find this was real. I wouldn't trust Verizon because of the negative headlines I've seen in the information security press and all the hoo-ha about privacy.
Yeah.
I'd say no to Verizon.
Yeah.
Just to respond slightly to your comment, yes, there are many scary stories. Many of them are stories. Yes, Verizon are a US company, but they have to comply with the same standards that every other organisation has to. And we have strict rules about where they can store data, how they operate. They're audited independently. So, yes, they do originate from another country, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're any less safe than anything else.
there's a question over here as well.
I still don't trust them.
This phone number,
Yep.
at some point you're going to have to provide a phone number to do this.
Yep.
Is that a one-time use of that phone number, or is it used at a later time as well?
In most cases, I believe it's used at a later time as well. It's used on subsequent logins as a two-factor authentication.
I was just wondering whether there ought to be a notice on there that this number is not stored, it's used one time, but if you use it multiple times, obviously you can't put that.
Yep.
Just again, a user interface aspect. When you tell people you need to refer to the driving license, it might be worth trying to do that earlier, because otherwise you go through a process. Oh, I'm not at home, or I don't have access to this at the moment. Oh, I've spent all this time getting to this point.
Yeah, the driving license questions come to maybe 3-4 clicks into the interaction. After we've built a little bit of understanding about the process, we've experimented with putting that information much earlier in the process, at the very start of the process. And if people see that they will be asked for information and they don't understand the reason for that, they're much more likely to abandon the process at that point. So we've made the choice to move those questions in a little bit, where we can manage the communication and build up understanding and confidence before we start talking about this information. So those are the kind of trade-offs we're making all the time.
There's a question at the back as well.
Yeah, just a question. What was the thinking behind the government adopting the policy of using a private third-party credit rating as a means of authenticating individuals? Like Ireland, we share the same problem. We don't have a national ID card for our citizens. Why didn't you go the route of, say, somebody presenting a passport at a post office, that you actually undertook the authentication on your citizen's behalf? It's a very brave decision to go the route of using a third party, particularly around credit rating, as a means of authenticating yourselves to government services. As the gentleman over here indicated, that's an important piece of information, whether it's stored elsewhere or not. But what was the rationale in actually going the route of using that third party?
So that's a very different question, of course, to the questions around the user interface. So we had a national identity scheme in the UK, which was withdrawn in 2010. It involved a centralised database with identity information on it for the entire population, was the intention. It was going to be a very expensive database to maintain, and there were a lot of security implications for that database. And the ability for it to be used was limited by those issues. And more fundamentally, people have to prove their identity or use their identity in 1,001 different instances, and it's not just something that's limited to public sector transactions. The challenge of creating usernames and passwords for every service that an individual uses is a wider problem that is being faced by individuals at the moment, and we need a generic solution to that problem. So this is a solution that works for government at what we call level of assurance 2, which is a relatively low level of assurance, higher than is commonly used at the moment, but not necessarily the same as, in legal terms, beyond all reasonable doubt, which is what's achieved at a higher level. And it is applicable for being used in the private sector as well. So we are looking at the generic problem. But it's probably a topic we should pick up in the panel session after the break, if that's all right. And we'll focus this morning on the demonstration and the user experience, and then come on to the EID regulation.
Okay. So we've got to a point where we're fairly sure that this individual has the information, that they have what they need to get through with a specific identity provider. In this case, let's choose Verizon. As one point before we go, we're also kind of providing additional information here about why identity, why these companies are here. And again, we're kind of adhering to that principle that the information is there for the people who need it. The majority of people don't actually, are less concerned about this. So we're getting that information out of the way for them, just providing a simple, very usable interface. At this point, they can choose their identity provider, and we'll take them. They will be then sent to the identity provider for a verification process that's managed by them. What we've got here is a prototype of that process. This is not a Verizon interface. This is just a mock-up that we use in our user research. But broadly speaking, the process they go through is that they would identify, enter their personal details, enter a username and password, their personal information. They then answer some questions generated. Hold on, let me see if I can step back a sec. They're then asked what kind of document they want. They need to show some form of document, a driving license or a passport. They can provide that. They fill out that information. And again, this is a prototype. This is not a real system. Following providing that personal information and their identity document, they get asked a series of questions based on their credit footprint. And again, these are not real questions. This is just a mock-up that we use in research. Provide a phone number, send a two-factor authentication code to that phone number, and at that point, they've been successfully verified. Now, we then receive them back to gov.uk at that point, and as they're being connected to the department who will handle the transaction that they originally came in for, we take that opportunity to kind of provide an additional bit of information. The important message that we're always trying to drive here is that you won't have to verify your identity again. This is a one-shot process. People struggle. That's a difficult message to get across to people. They often think that this will be for just the transaction that they're coming in for. And from there, they get handed back to the relying party, the department who's handling the transaction they originally came in for.
Why not choice questions for the information that only the user is supposed to know? Give someone a fighting chance to guess.
Again, that's more of a kind of policy side thing.
I didn't quite get it. So why multiple choice questions for?
For the questions that only the user should know.
For questions that user. So. Obviously, a fraudster would have to then take a guess at that.
It gives them a fighting chance.
It does, and so there's some mathematics behind that in terms of the number of questions that are being asked and the number of options that they've got and the probability that they'll be able to guess all the right answers, which is deemed to be an acceptable probability in relation to the level of assurance that we want around the identity.
But why does it need to be multiple choice at all?
What would the as opposed to?
What are the first two letters, rather than give them a choice of 5?
I think this. Yeah. So this is a demonstration. This is something that we've mocked up internally for our own testing purposes. It's up to the identity providers to work with the certification bodies around the standards to make sure that the verification standards are being adhered to. So this is just an example. Yeah. It wasn't put up as a sort of, this is actually how it's happening. But we can.
Similarly, I mean, from my perspective as well as a usability guy, if you're asking for things like specific amounts that are being, how much was your last credit card payment or something like that. If you ask something like that and you ask people to enter that information, there's a lot of opportunity for error there. And I think for me, that's, we're trying to make it as you help people get through in as, make it as usable as we can do. And so things like that are going to help prevent people making errors.
But the identity providers will be trying different methods to achieve what Pete's describing there, to get people through. It's in their interest to get people through, but they have to comply with the standards. So there will be innovations in that space and different approaches tried.
Lots of questions over.
Okay, so I've done this process and I now have some kind of profile on the Verify system. But circumstances may change. You're only renewing your driving license every 10 years. It may be in 18 months' time when I need to use it again. Between now and then, can I access my profile and amend things? So my telephone number's changed, I don't want to use Experian anymore, I want to use Verizon, etc., etc. So what control, why is there no information at the end of the thing saying you now have a profile which you can go to and you can amend and change whenever you want to?
From a customer experience perspective, I guess I don't know why that wouldn't exist.
That information, I can say that information comes via email to the person, so there will be a confirmation email. Okay. But from our perspective, that is a relationship between you and the company that verified your identity. So we don't store any information about you that you would come to us to update. And I think that's one of the fundamental things about the system. And it's up to you, if you want to create a new identity with Verizon, create a new identity with whoever, you can do that.
So I would have to create a new identity with a different identity provider?
You wouldn't have to.
But so I could actually have multiple identities?
Yes.
You can, yes.
And you could access your own account through those. You could access the same data set through those.
Isn't there an assumption here that he has a relationship with Experian? There's a built-in assumption there, whereas I'm guessing what you're driving at is you don't have anything to do with they're there in the background, and if you apply for a credit card, maybe the credit card company will check with you, but you directly do not have a relationship with them, nor do you want a relationship with them. You have a relationship with the government. The government is my identity provider. They were the ones who give me my passport and my driver's license. I don't really give a damn about Experian.
So under this model, then the customer has a choice of who the identity provider will be, and we've got the first two up and running now, but there is another procurement coming, and there will be other identity providers.
There's no general consensus in the public of mine, including mine, that what I need in life is an identity provider. I don't have that feeling. I don't have that sentiment. My identity provider is the government. Period.
Yeah, I mean, there are, and that's one of the kind of sets of expectations that we struggle to deal with, because the common expectation is the government knows everything about me, these companies I have no relationship with. And that is something that we struggle with. However, almost the inverse is actually true. Central Verify knows nothing about these people and doesn't, I think it's fair to say one of the goals of what we're doing is avoiding that situation where we know we have a hoard of information about everyone.
But you do have that information, it's just fragmented. You have my national insurance number, you have my hospital number, you have my driver's license number, you have my passport number.
Adam can...
Well, that's very interesting, but you just listed a whole load of identifiers. None of those are your identity. They are linked to your identity, but they're not you. The bits that we're really interested in are about you as a person. And that's what we're trying to do here. This is why this is so different to Gateway. Gateway was, as David rightly said, all about authenticating. Great. The problem with that was it was difficult for people to use. It was inconsistent across departments. The vast majority of people actually recreated a new identity in inverted commas every year because they forgot their credentials. And it let them do it because it wasn't an identity. It was simply a means of logging in. When you then touched the government department, you had to go through a whole enrolment process, which involved you then answering lots of questions about who you were and what you did, to be able to actually complete that transaction. Now, what we don't want to do is continue to do that with every single transaction in government, because A, it's very wasteful, but B, each individual transaction does things slightly differently. It needs different levels of assurance. It needs different information about you. Far better to identify you singularly as a person, and then be able to use that identity across everything. And that's what we're trying to do.
So I wonder whether we should, because Adam's going to be up here in a moment, and so's Neil, and he'll have a microphone there so we can record it. For exactly. So we can have the conversation in a moment. So Peter's our user experience designer, and I think it's probably best if we focus while Pete's up here on questions around the user experience, and then we'll come back to the more fundamental questions around the federated identity model, and then with Neil as well, the wider federated identity model across Europe, which is the main theme of today. So we'll come back to those in a moment. So we'll focus now on the user experience questions.
I don't know whether you're going to cover it, but in case you're not, on subsequent logins,
yep.
when you come back, what you give, presumably you have to give your username and your password that's just created.
Yep.
What else, and how does that differ from an old-fashioned conventional authentication process?
If I were coming to that same transaction having already been verified on another transaction, I would say, is this your first time verifying your identity? I would say, no, it's not my first time. I would be asked who verified me. In this case, I would select, let's say I select Verizon. I would provide a username. And again, this is a mock-up of roughly how we think identity providers are doing this. The individual solutions may be different, but this is a mock-up that we use in research. Provide username, password, and two-factor authentication. In this case, as a code sent to a mobile phone, and then you're through. You've been verified. You're through to your transaction.
Did you just explain that you increase the user's cognitive workload there?
In what way?
Well, you said when he comes back to log on, you asked him who he used to verify him in the first place.
Yes.
So some months previous,
yes.
I'm having to remember.
Yes. We recognise that. We recognise that is a usability challenge in this interface.
It's a big one.
Yeah, it is. Part of the architecture of the system is that we do not record information about, we do not record who is using what identity provider, who is using what service. Okay. No, yeah, no, it is, but it's something that, given the current system architecture, is very hard to get around. There is copy in there to help people, identify some ways in which they could find out who theirs is, but effectively that task is down to them. We can't help them with that at that point.
Maybe a little prompt to say you will need to remember this when you return to the website, something like that. A little message saying, before you leave us, you've done properly, you will need this bullet point, because 6 months' time I may not remember who verified me unless I really did that.
Yeah.
And alone somebody who is a pensioner or maybe.
And that sort of stuff comes in the emails they get at the end of the verification process from the identity provider.
It won't matter because you can just use a different verifier.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
you find yourself in a situation where
I assume you're going to get stuck on that. Just don't get stuck on that page because that is very frustrating.
Yeah. Question at the back?
Sorry, I very slightly missed the last 30 seconds of your presentation.
Yep.
Did you end up by saying that on the last page it says this user ID and password you just created can now be used in lots of different places on the Gov?
Something along those lines. We're very careful with the language we use here because of how this has been rolled out as a beta program. We can't say it's used for everything because at the moment it's a limited beta.
It was interesting because I could picture myself sitting in front of the screen doing this.
Yeah.
Because I actively try and avoid any time when I've got to create another set of credentials.
Yeah.
Because it's more open for
Yeah.
me. Well, probably a lot of people in here, I'm an IT
Yeah.
guy, I've got them coming out my ears. And I would be shouting at the screen, going, for God's sake, I just want to get a new driving licence. Why do I have to have another login? But if you told me at the beginning, this is going to be a good idea because once you've got this login, you can access loads of different Gov facilities. I think,
that's why we say that on the second page that talks about benefits. It's one of the key benefits that we say right at the beginning to try and encourage that use. You'll only ever have to do this once. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I only have to do this once. But is that once just to get a driving licence, or is it once to do everything we Gov? This is the thing.
Yeah.
I don't want to have another ID just to get a blooming driving licence.
Yeah. So I think one of the things I want to point out is that all of these different questions about this interaction, it's kind of the problem that we've been trying to solve. I think the previous version tried to address as many questions, you know, all of the questions, and what we ended up having was a situation where we had so much information that the vast majority of people just weren't taking it in. The vast majority of people weren't reading it. So what we've tried to do here, yes, there are areas where we can all think of questions that are not directly addressed at the surface level of this interface. But what we've tried to do is triage those issues as much as possible and build something that's really, really, really simple and hopefully provide ways where the people who've got those questions can actually find their way to that information without putting barriers in the way for everyone. And I think for us, that's been the kind of goal of designing this. And yes, there will always be bits of information that you could always say, well, maybe we should have said this, maybe we should have said that. But what we're trying to do is kind of build that pyramid where we're exposing the minimum that everyone absolutely has to know to get through this with a positive experience. And for people who've got concerns about this, the kind of people who show up at conferences about identity, then there is more information in there. But I think you guys are not our core audience. You know, you're not typical punters. So we're trying to build something that gives a positive experience for the vast majority.
And it's worth saying as well, Pete, isn't it? I've heard you say it before, that this is a point in time. This is December 2014, you know, just after launch of a beta service.
Yeah.
And this will continually change because the market will continually change and people's understanding of it will change. Yeah. And the design will change to reflect that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really important thing. I mean, already we're, you know, literally on a week-by-week basis at the moment, we're having to think about ways of evolving this because the kind of situation is changing so fast in terms of the identity providers coming on, in terms of changes of capability, and the similar, you know, as increasing public awareness, yeah, we're going to definitely have to change the way we talk about it.
I think you could get caught up here for most of the day, actually.
Yes.
So I'm going to let Pete sit down, and I think a round of applause for Pete. Thank you.